Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that we oftentimes like to go back to the gospel, go back, of course, to the book of Acts in the New Testament. We've even had a number of tours of Israel. We've gone to Israel, in Greece, Israel in Rome. And so one of the books I thought we might want to focus on this hour would be very helpful. If you've ever gone to Israel, ever gone to the Holy Land, as you read through this book, you will love it because there are so many pictures of places where you have been, and it really helps you understand a little bit more of what actually you were able to take in. But even for those of you, and I would say that would be the majority of you listening right now, that probably will never be able to make it to Israel, this really gives you an opportunity to see and feel what is in the gospel. Now, of course, it's really important to read the four gospels. It's important to learn about the life of Jesus, and then even to follow the book of Acts and go to Caesarea and go to Philippi and go to Corinth and really get a sense of what that was like. But this is a book that I think you're going to really enjoy because it pulls together the geography, it pulls together a lot of the archaeology that we've talked about here on Point of View. And it is written by Robert Hutchinson. You might be familiar with his name because he's been with us before as we've talked about his book, Searching for Jesus. And even more recently, we have replayed that interview on a number of occasions. So you might say, yes, I do remember him because just recently I've had a chance to hear the replay of that excellent interview. Individual that studied philosophy as an undergraduate, moved to Israel to learn Hebrew, came back and received a graduate degree in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, has really developed a tremendous skill at writing and taking us into the story of Jesus in the New Testament. So, Robert, welcome back to Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks for having me on again.
One of the things I love about this book is you have so many pictures. I know that makes the book a little more expensive, but it is just so wonderful because if you've ever traveled to the Holy Land, ever had a chance to go on a tour, you've seen some of this. But even if you have not, it is just wonderful that you not only give us, if you will, the narrative, but you actually show us what it looks like in some of these places that are described in the Bible.
Yeah, I thought that was very important, and you're right. I really had to push to get the pictures in because it's a pain for publishers to include a lot of pictures, but it really brings the story alive, I think, when you can actually see the actual places. And so many of the sites of the Gospels and Acts still exist, and in a startling way, pretty much as they existed in the time of Jesus. And a lot of people don't realize that, and I thought it was very important to have that.
Well, I think that is the case. You know, if you're in the Galilee, you have Capernaum. If you're on the coast, you have Caesarea Maritima. If you, of course, go over to Greece, you know, basically Corinth looks like Corinth did then. Philippi, ruined, but still looks like it does then. And so there is a sense in which when you talk about walking where Jesus walked or walk where Paul walked, you can understand that in ways that really make the Bible come alive, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I try to do with this. Is I've told people, anybody who has an opportunity to go to Israel should absolutely do it. It is expensive. It's a difficult trip for many people, especially if you're older, but it's really well worth it because the Bible really does come alive when you're there. I think for many people, they hear the gospel stories in church, and they hear them over and over again, and they just kind of lose the sense that this is real, that this actually happened. And that's what I was trying to do in this book, is to kind of bring it alive, tell it in a fresh way, fill in some of the details that the gospel writers didn't feel they didn't really need to say, because they presuppose everybody already knew all this stuff. But we don't know that stuff, and so I tried to fill in the details from archaeology and just traveling, just what it looks like today, so that it would be a little easier for people to see in one coherent way.
The book is published by Thomas Nelson. It is hardback. We have information about Robert on the website, as well as about this book, The Dawn of Christianity. And the subtitle, for a minute, I might just mention how God used simple fishermen, soldiers, and prostitutes to transform the world. That reminded me a little bit of the conversation we've had with Dr. Rodney Stark on one of his books, The Twilight of Christianity, trying to explain why this, if you will, Jesus cult eventually dominated the Roman Empire and took over Western culture. In a sense, that really is the story of the gospel and the story of the book of Acts, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I've been criticized because I wasn't implying Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. But, you know, Jesus says that tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven before you, the Pharisees. So to me, that is a sign that there were prostitutes among his followers, or reformed prostitutes. And, what Rodney Stark says is, and he's blurred my book, and I think he's absolutely wonderful, is one of the big reasons for the success of Christianity was its inclusive character, that it was open, not merely to an elite, but to everybody. God is calling all people into his kingdom, not just, the elite of the elite or something. And that was the story behind the subtitle.
Well, it certainly is a great subtitle, by the way, because I certainly agree with that. And I might just mention, before we get into the book per se, that you say, I write as a Christian, but not only for Christians, but for people without any religious ties or interested in learning who Jesus of Nazareth actually was. This is the kind of book that if you had just an open-minded individual might say, okay, I'll give you a chance to convince me that what I've been hearing about the Bible, maybe even read when I was in Sunday school, I'll take a chance and read through this, because you really are just kind of taking them through the various aspects of the New Testament and giving them geographical insight, historical insight, and archaeological discoveries that really validate and actually confirm all the things that you find in the New Testament.
Yeah, I mean, I really do feel my mission, if I can describe it so grandly, is to reach out to everybody, not just believing Christians, but the whole world, and retell the gospel story and the good news in an accessible way that everybody can understand and can at least follow. And I feel like a lot of you have scholars writing scholarly books, and then you have kind of apologetic books written for believers, and not too many people write for just ordinary people that maybe went to church when they were young but have fallen away from the faith in some way. And those people, I think, deserve to be reached out to as well. And that's what I try to do in this book, is basically retell the story of the Gospels and fill in the details that may make it come alive more for modern secular people.
Let's take a break. But again, some of the sources obviously are the New Testament, the works of Josephus, the Talmud, as well as various historians and the Dead Sea Scrolls, early Christian writers and things of that nature, as well as all sorts of archaeological discoveries that have come down, and then just the evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament. When we come back, we're going to start out and begin in the gospel stories and work our way to the book of Acts, and just share a little bit of the road to Jerusalem, alive, beginning of persecution, and the expansion of the Jesus movement. All that coming up right after these important messages. Our conversation today with Robert Hutchinson, The Dawn of Christianity. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Senator Joe Manchin sees the irony. He says we have 11 million jobs that aren't filled, 8 million still unemployed. Something's not matching up here. Good, high-paying jobs go unfilled. The National Federation of Independent Business did a survey of small business owners and found that half of them reported job openings that could not be filled. That was a 48-year record high. We all know what happens if you pay people not to work, but the problem is more complex than that. The $300 weekly federal unemployment insurance bonus expired last month. Some economists estimate there might be another million job gains, but in August there were 5.3 million fewer jobs than when the pandemic began. Concerns about the virus may be one reason some aren't looking for work, but it may also be that more Americans got used to not working during the lockdown. In my most recent booklet, A Biblical View on Work, I suggest that the decline of a Christian worldview has also led to a decline of the work ethic. While it is tempting to say that Americans who aren't working are merely lazy, they're also rational. An economist at the University of Chicago found that when counting all government benefits, a family of four in high welfare benefit states such as New York and Connecticut with two unemployed parents can receive up to $100,000 in government assistance. That may be an extreme example, but it illustrates why we find unfilled jobs in trucking, manufacturing, and business services. These are high-paying jobs, but they must compete with generous government benefits along with COVID-19 concerns. This year, Americans should be working hard, but millions apparently are hardly working. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the book, The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. Robert Hutchinson is our guest. It is published by Thomas Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it. So if you'd like to get it in hardback or Kindle, I really would encourage you to get a hardback because of all the great pictures there that would help you understand the context. It is available on our website, pointofview.net. Robert, let's, if we can, go to Jesus standing on the lake shore, calling for these individuals to become fishers of men. Tell us more.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me, and I don't think is emphasized enough, is that Jesus had a specific plan, and he really did intend, in my opinion, to found a movement. And in the early years, scholars call this the Jesus movement, but it's clear that he intended this to go and continue in time and spread across the entire world. And so I think he's still calling us today, and that movement still exists, and that's what we call the Christian church. And for a long time, people used to deny that. They used to say that Jesus really didn't intend to found a church, and I think he absolutely did, and I think the evidence is overwhelming that he did, and that it started very small with just groups of siblings and friends, and as Rodney Stark points out in his books, it quickly spread like wildfire throughout the entire Mediterranean, and it basically transformed the world and continues to this day. So I just wanted to make that come alive and show how that kind of happened. And I had that wonderful scene at Tagba where Jesus calls Peter and invites him to become a fisher of men. The more I studied this, the more I just was overwhelmed by a sense of the historicity of all this, of this actually happening, because being in the place at the time and looking at the recent archaeological discoveries, it just overwhelms you, the plausibility of everything. That doesn't mean it's hard, it's not easy, or that it's easy to piece everything together and make a coherent story. And I think everybody should try and do that sometime, is try and actually take the Gospels and then try and work out your own putting it all together and try and make the pieces fit and come up with a coherent story, because it's difficult to do, but it actually teaches you a lot.
One of the things I appreciate, again, I wish this were television where we could show all the pictures, because you show a typical boat. Of course, we've had what was called the Jesus boat that was found in the mud. You have a picture of where it's most likely that John the Baptist baptized him, and I've actually baptized believers there. You have pictures of the Mount of Olives. You have the actual stone staircase, which were the ones that Jesus and all of the disciples walked up and down, most likely even where Peter actually gave the message during Pentecost. You have pictures of the silver coin that is very similar to the one that Jesus used, and all the way up to, of course, the old city of Jerusalem, and even leading into the Passover meal, the Last Supper. So as we go through this, we can follow with tremendous precision where Jesus was, what he said, and then the record that we have, and then we can go to those geographical locations, and many of them still look somewhat like they did even in the first century, don't they?
Absolutely. And when you actually are trying to put the story together, like, well, where was Jesus in Jerusalem? When would he have said this? It becomes even more obvious, because there were really only like two places in Jerusalem where a large group of people could gather. It was a very dense city, a lot like the way it is today. The old city of Jerusalem with narrow streets, and there's not a lot of places for people to gather, but there are two. And one is the Pool of Siloam, and the other is the so-called Rabbi Steps at the foot of the temple, and in the Gospels, where they describe Jesus' confrontations with the Pharisees and the crowds in Jerusalem before the cleansing of the temple, that I am convinced is exactly where that happened. Jesus was on the top of the Rabbi Steps, where thousands, if not tens of thousands of people could have gathered and heard him debate the Pharisees. And when you really study the archaeological layout of Jerusalem, everything starts to fit together. It really starts to make sense. Yes, he was probably on the Rabbi Steps when this happened, and during these debates with the Pharisees, then the moment came, and they went through the underground tunnel that brought you up into the top of the temple area, and that's where the confrontation with the money changers and everything happened. So really, when you look at the archaeology of it and you look at the layout of the city, it all fits together in a way that I don't think people really realize.
And again, let's talk about some other steps, because you also have the steps leading up to basically the house of Caiaphas. A lot of people say, I want to walk where Jesus walked on the Via Dolorosa or whatever. Well, that's really probably closer, because we know where the house of Caiaphas is. We've seen the prison. We've seen the steps. And so whether you're talking about the trial or then the ultimate persecution and crucifixion and resurrection, there are some places where we can actually still see the steps where Jesus walked.
Yes, absolutely. Those steps are absolutely considered authentic by most archaeologists. They may have been replaced over the centuries. They may not be the actual steps, but that's definitely the staircase leading up to the house of Caiaphas. But yeah, every year they're finding more and more stuff. They found the palace of Herod in 2015. They finally unearthed the palace of Herod, Herod the Great, where a lot of people now believe that was where Jesus was interrogated by Pilate, and not in the Antonia fortress, which was a tower that guarded the palace precincts. And so that radically changes what the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, would have been. That's one of the big changes that archaeology has made in an attempt to reconstruct on a minute-to-minute basis what actually happened. And I'm convinced that's probably exactly what happened. Jesus was interrogated in King Herod the Great's palace, which was the Roman Praetorium at the time, and not in the Antonia fortress, which meant walk to Golgotha was actually much shorter than people used to think.
Well, and that brings us to, of course, the tomb. First of all, even before you get to that, there is also the tomb of the prophets. And one time I had a chance to go in there on the Mount of Olives. But this, of course, leads to where the tomb is. You can have a big debate about that one way or the other. In some respects, I'm glad that we don't necessarily have confirmation on that because, as you well know, almost any time something seems to be or is considered to be the actual whatever, we almost always see a shrine built and a church built on top of it. So that is, again, one of the other very important issues as well. Where was Jesus buried? And, of course, the fact is he's no longer in the tomb in the first place.
Yes. I mean, that's a big debate. A lot of people like the garden tomb. They think it first is prettier. And
Yes.
But I think the traditional tomb is probably more likely, but it's obviously not a big issue of theological import. But when you try and write a book to reconstruct what actually happened, you got to kind of make those kinds of decisions. And what I try to do in my book is, rather than just be dogmatic about it and say this is what happened, I try and say, well, there is debate about this, but this is what I think is most likely.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to spend just a little bit of time. Obviously, we put Jesus in the tomb, but we'll get him out, and that will be the resurrection. And then a whole section that you have written about the beginning of persecution, and that is the Sanhedrin and the martyrdom of Stephen, the ministry of Peter. Of course, we got to get into Paul as well. And so whether we look at what is happening here in Jerusalem, or pretty soon we're going to move to Caesarea Maritima, we're going to eventually move to Europe as well and see the expansion of the gospel. We're going to look at a little bit more of that as well. And so I do commend to you this book because it would be just a great resource. Whether you've been able to go to the Holy Land or not, I think you will find it very helpful. Since we're talking about archaeology, one of the booklets we've been making available is on archaeology because last year was really a very significant year in archaeology. So there's some great resources there that you might want to get a hold of through us at Point of View. And most importantly, let me also mention that we have a link to roberthutchinson.com. And so if you want to know more about all sorts of things that he has been writing, there are books, there are articles, there's a YouTube channel. Maybe you'd like to have him come speak sometime. You'd like to know a little bit more about some of the issues he's been writing about. It's all on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the other aspects of this book. The resurrection, the advancement of the gospel through the apostles, the beginning of persecution, and then just the remarkable expansion of the Jesus movement and how that took place. If nothing else, we can learn some of these lessons from the first century as we apply them to our 21st century, because in many ways our world is very much the world like the world that actually the gospel was presented into. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Robert Hutchinson right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Robert Hutchinson. Again, the earlier book, Searching for Jesus. This one is out, The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. And so, if nothing else, Robert, let's now realize that Jesus is killed on the cross. His death is certified by the Romans. He is placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, wrapped very quickly in various linens and spices. And then a stone is rolled against the tomb. And, of course, you have the Roman guard. And then reports start coming that the tomb is empty and that the disciples have seen the risen Jesus. Take us through that whole scenario that is kind of the middle part of your book.
Well, it's hard when you're trying to be an historian to reconstruct this because there are minor details in the Gospels. But it's very, very clear that the overwhelming testimony is that the women found the empty tomb and that they encountered an angel or perhaps two angels, and that evening Jesus appeared to his disciples in the room of the Last Supper. The problem for modern people is they find that incredible, and so there's kind of two ways of trying to approach it. Some people try to prove it historically that with historical proofs to show the plausibility of this, and that's kind of my approach. And other people say that you kind of have to take this on faith because we don't have enough corroborating evidence, or the amount of information about the resurrection appearances is relatively small in the total context of the Gospels. So I just acknowledge that with people when people ask me this on radio shows and so on. Where's the overwhelming proof for this? And I always say there is not overwhelming proof that's going to convince an absolute skeptic that has his mind closed. But there's plenty of proof for people that have an open mind and are willing to accept the testimony of other people.
One of the things you also talk about is that, of course, we have the record in the Gospels, but now let's go into 1 Corinthians, because Paul then gives us records of some things that are not in the Gospels. The appearance to Paul and the appearance to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have fallen asleep, appears to James and to all the apostles. So you have Jesus on earth for 40 days. And so that takes us, of course, to the Ascension. And, of course, that's the top of the Mount of Olives. And that is then followed with a preaching by Peter before the onlookers. And he doesn't do that off in a corner or in another area, but basically right there in Jerusalem, and says these are individuals that have indeed seen him, and this was not done in a corner, and that this is, again, something that we are actually testifying to you right here in Jerusalem itself.
Yes, and one thing that's always made me wonder was, why were the early followers of Jesus persecuted at all? They did not reject the Torah. They continued to worship in the temple. They continue to be good Jews. There are plenty of other organizations or groups that were openly treasonous, like the Essenes, that basically said the entire temple establishment was illegitimate and corrupt, and they went out into the desert and practiced what they thought was pure Judaism. Yet the Christians were the ones that were really singled out, and the Gospels make clear, and also the works of Josephus, that they were actively persecuted from the very beginning. And my question was always, why? Why were they so persecuted? And I think it comes down to the fact that they were invoking the name of Jesus in the same way that Jews invoke the name of God, Hashem, which is still the word that the Orthodox Jews refer to God as Hashem, the name. And Jesus was the name before whom all people must bend a knee. And I think this struck the Orthodox Jews of the time as absolutely blasphemous and a very, very big threat. and that was why they were persecuted so much.
Well, let's get into that because that's part 3 of your book. John 15:18, Jesus says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you." And so we have examples of miraculous healings that are taking place with Peter and John, and we have all sorts of things happening. You have then an introduction to Saul of Tarsus. Of course, we now know him as Paul. You have the first martyr, which is Stephen. And again, we can place much of that in the historical and archaeological context, can't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's even a few places around Jerusalem where they think the stoning of Stephen actually occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, the reason that he was stoned was because he had his vision of seeing Jesus at the right hand of God, and that was just too much for the Jewish establishment of that time. That was just simply blasphemy. And that was why he was executed. But that does raise interesting questions, which is if the Jewish Sanhedrin had the power to put Stephen to death, why didn't they have the power to put Jesus to death and turn him over to the Romans and so on? But I just raise that kind of as an aside.
Kind of interesting. Well, let's continue on because one of the things I thought was kind of interesting is, you read about Philip and the eunuch, Ethiopian eunuch, probably took place in the Negev desert. But again, you can see that the people of Ethiopia had a connection to Israel and Judaism for millennia. So it's not surprising that when he comes alongside this is an individual reading out of the Old Testament, and he asks him, "Do you understand what you're reading?"
Yes. I mean, once again, the thing that strikes me when you try and retell a story like this in a modern way is how plausible it all is, how much it just makes a lot of sense, just as a story. None of this strikes me as fictional embellishment or legends or something like that. It all seems very, very plausible. When you go back and try and research the history of the Ethiopians and their connection to Jerusalem, which they have had for millennia, and so today the Falashim from Ethiopia are considered Jews by the people of Israel and are allowed to come as under the law of return. All of this stuff is verified by history and what we know of ancient people. So it was just a very, very fun project for me to research this. I learned a ton. And I was forced to go back and research things that I glossed over as I was writing the book, or as I was growing up reading the Gospels that I hadn't really researched, and that's why it's a fun book.
Well, let's take one more just before we take a break, and that is Caesarea. This was something outside of Jerusalem, and it was kind of a place built first by Herod and then taken over by the Romans. But here you see Peter being brought to this kind of foreign place, if you will, not a place where a Jewish person would willingly go, although later Paul goes there under arrest, but goes there, and that is the baptism of Cornelius. And whenever we take people to Caesarea, they are just shocked at how much is there, and it gives you a real sense of what it was like to have been a Roman soldier in that place, or even to have been coming there as a seafarer or as an individual that was a sailor or a merchant, because much of it still remains, and you can get in your mind's eye exactly what it must have been like for Peter and then later for Paul to be there in Caesarea.
Oh, yes. It just blows your mind when you go to Caesarea. It's a beautiful place. It's right on the Mediterranean. They've reconstructed a lot of the ancient sites. The theater is there facing the ocean. The Hippodrome, which is where they had the chariot races. And so it's very easy when you try and reconstruct what happened in Caesarea to be able to describe the geography of the place, especially if you've been there. You can just see it. And Caesarea, by the way, was also the site for the breakout of the Jewish war against the Romans that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. It was in Caesarea where a conflict broke out between the Jewish community and Greeks and Romans over a synagogue, and the Greeks sacrificed in front of a synagogue a pig.
Yes.
As a kind of an insult, and a fight broke out, and the Romans responded by massacring practically the entire Jewish community in Caesarea, and that that's what triggered the revolt against Rome that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. So.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about that last section briefly, the expansion of the Jesus movement, because, of course, then you have the establishment of so many churches, and you can go to what it looked like in Antioch, what it looked like in Corinth, what it looked like in Philippi, and many others, and get a real sense of how this expansion of the Jesus movement eventually took over the Roman Empire and was established as part of Western civilization. So it's all part of just an outstanding book, The Dawn of Christianity. It is published by our friends at Thomas Nelson. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Robert Hutchinson right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robert Hutchinson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, The Dawn of Christianity. And I might just mention, this was published by Thomas Nelson. You might want to also look for the previous book, Searching for Jesus. And another one I might just mention, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible. And those are all ones that Robert has written about. But let's, if we can, talk about this idea of going and making disciples of all nations, the Great Commission, because then you have some chapters that help us understand that these house churches that were developed in Macedonia and Asia Minor eventually spread throughout the Western world. And as a result, this was taking the Great Commission to more than just Judea and Samaria, but to the uttermost parts of the world.
Yes, I mean, that was the big issue when they started. Was this movement primarily to the Jews, or was this movement meant for the entire world? And at first, Paul and Peter also reached out to Jewish synagogues where there were pagans who were called God-fearers, who basically wanted to, who believed in Judaism, believed in the God of Israel, but didn't want to fully convert because that meant circumcision for the men. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of were on the periphery. And so their natural place to go when they were first preaching the gospel were to Jewish synagogues. But they started encountering increased hostility there because of the radical claims they were making about Jesus. And then they started to bring the message directly to pagan communities and had tremendous success with that. And so that basically created the crisis that led to the First Council of Jerusalem, or the only Council of Jerusalem, over whether you first had to convert to Judaism before you could become a follower of the way, or if that wasn't required. And that had to be hammered out in the First Council of the Church in about 49 A.D. So.
And again, a very good chapter there on the Council of Jerusalem. But then you have one of these ossuaries, and again, there's a lot of debate about this, but if nothing else, the inscription seems to say James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And if it is authentic, it is the first archaeological confirmation of Jesus of Nazareth. And, of course, we've seen so many confirmations of Pontius Pilate, Herod, you name whatever you need. This has been just a banner couple of years in archaeology. And, of course, we've had a lot of historical evidence, but it's just been interesting to see how some of these archaeological finds just once again reinforce and confirm the historicity and the accuracy of the New Testament.
Yeah, the James ossuary it just blows you away because all the ossuaries really blow you. They found the ossuary of Caiaphas. That no one disputes the ossuary of Caiaphas whatsoever. There is debate over the James ossuary, whether it's a forgery or if it's actually authentic. But there's the people added extra words to the inscriptions on it, and that's been actually adjudicated in court in Israel. And it's still disputed. There are a number of evangelical scholars like Ben Worthington and others who accept it as authentic. Some people don't think it's authentic, but either way, it's just an amazing time for biblical archaeology. And I wanted to get into all that stuff in this book and tell people that while still telling the story. I was always interested in the details, like how much did a boat trip cost? How much did it cost to go to Cyprus? And so I spent a lot of time trying to work out things like that, like, how much money did Paul and Barnabas need to make this expedition? And there was a UCLA computer program, I think, maybe it was Stanford University, that actually figured it cost about 237 denarii per person in over 2 months. So basically it was $18,900 each, or about $37,000 the equivalent to make the two trips for the first missionary journey. So I was always interested in the practical details.
And just fascinating. And one more I might just add, this is in my little booklet on archaeology. A lot of people say, well, how accurate is some of this? Because Luke has been the one, as you well know, that's always been attacked. Because, first of all, he wrote the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote the book of Acts. And Colin Hemmer, in his book, documents the fact that Luke, especially in the latter chapters of the book of Acts, there's 84 different facts in the book of Acts that have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research. We're talking about nautical details, names of gods, designation of magistrates, proper names and titles. The more we dig in the ancient Near East and find archaeological evidence, the more we find various historical references. We time and time again, Robert, don't we find just how accurate the New Testament was? And if indeed it is accurate in the historical details, maybe indeed we can also understand that it's accurate in terms of its supernatural and spiritual details as well, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm blown away by just every year. That just this year there was another discovery of a roadway built by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. They were uncovering stuff like this every year. That doesn't mean it's not difficult to fit all the pieces together when you try to tell a kind of a harmonized view of the story, which people try and do when they create. Instead of having four Gospels, you just have one story. It's still difficult to get it all fit together, and there's various explanations for how you can make those pieces jive and so on. But you're right. The archaeological evidence is confirming people, places, and beliefs in the Gospels. Almost every week, there's something new is discovered.
Well, again, the archaeological booklet that we have, just one that, again, says if you got 10 minutes, we'd want to tell you a few things. But again, if you want to spend some real time getting into the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts in particular, and begin to work from the first teaching of Jesus all the way to the final establishment of some of these churches in Asia Minor, this book will take you through that. You'll learn a lot about the various archaeological discoveries that have already been made, some of the historical inferences, and material that is not in the Bible simply because when this was written, people understood that. They had been there. They knew what it was talking about. But now in our 21st century, looking back, sometimes it gives you another perspective, helps you understand a little bit more of what was being communicated at the time in terms of the life and time of Jesus, of Peter, and of Paul. So, Robert, I appreciate the good work that you've done, first of all, in searching for Jesus, as well as in this book, The Dawn of Christianity. But one more time, let me mention your website, because we have that on our website, pointofview.net, and people can click on your picture or simply go to roberthutchinson.com. And what will they find when they land on the website?
Oh, they'll have links to all my books, all my articles, my podcast, way to contact me, anything they want.
And I might just mention, you've got a number of books, you've got a number of articles, you've got a YouTube channel, and most importantly, if people might want to have you come and speak to their church or learn a little bit more about some of this so that they can take this and apply it in a more effective way, all available at your website, roberthutchinson.com. So, Robert, thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View, and I always look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kerby. It's been an honor. Thanks very much.
Well, that's all we have for the book. It is called The Dawn of Christianity. It is published by Thomas Nelson. I noticed that it is very inexpensive for a hardback book, so you might want to check it out, and we have links there. Of course, if you go to the book at the end, it has all of his information, his website, his address, and others. And if you've always said, I'd like to know more about the Holy Land, I probably will never get there, but I'm glad to read a book and look at all the pictures that and the diagrams that are there. This is perhaps the book you want. And if you've ever been to Israel, it will be just a great way to put some of the bits and pieces that you collected over the years into one coherent way. So again, the book is entitled The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we have some more to cover, and we will do so. But feel free to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find all the links necessary, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. They're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I want to spend some time talking about debt in a variety of different ways, and the reason I'm doing that is multifaceted. The first is we have a booklet on the subject of debt, which we've made available to individuals, so that is reason enough. But more importantly, it is a topic that doesn't get mentioned very often. If you think about it, in the 2016 election, neither presidential candidate spent much time talking about that. There aren't a whole lot of members of Congress that are talking about this, and yet even though we bring up the fact that we have $22 trillion in debt, heading towards $23 trillion in debt, nothing seems to be changing and no action seems to be taken. And we are in that situation in terms of government debt. So I want to spend some time in this first segment talking about that. But then I want to spend most of our time talking about consumer debt, personal debt, auto loan debt, student loan debt, because this is what is certainly been affecting you as an individual, affecting your family. Quite frankly, it's also affecting the churches. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about how giving to Christian organizations, giving to churches, giving to mission organizations has declined because if people are in debt, they don't have the kind of opportunity to give towards the Lord's work. So there are a lot of implications to this whole idea of debt. But let me, for a few minutes at least, talk about what the government is dealing with, and oftentimes, and I'm saying dealing with hypothetically because most people aren't really addressing the issue. And of course, the government is in about $22 trillion in debt. And that amount, if that helps put this in perspective, is more than the gross domestic product of the United States. That alone should concern you. If your debt as an individual was more than your annual income, you would think you were in a really bad situation. Of course, you don't have the ability to print money or borrow money the way the federal government does, but it's a source of some concern. In one of the articles that I wrote recently, and by the way, I'm going to just a few minutes talk about how you can get some of this material free of charge. We have it on our website. It's from one of our Outlook magazines. It came out a number of months ago. I point out that I, more than a decade ago, wrote about my concern that we might eventually have a national debt that would reach $20 trillion by the year 2020. Well, as you can see, we hit $22 trillion long before we got to the year 2020. And even then pointed out the fact that that would probably have been 90% of the gross domestic product. So the point is that when I was writing about this a decade ago in my Viewpoints commentary, I was already concerned about what it would be like if we were $20 trillion in debt. Well, we're $22 trillion in debt, and nobody seems to be talking about it, although we're talking about it today here on Point of View. So some people have said that the whole issue is like the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of every American, and it's going to have some impact. How so? First, the issue of foreign investment. When our debt load exceeds our annual income, there's a number of things that start happening because, as I pointed out, you can imagine what it's like if your credit card debt is larger than your annual income. You can think of college students who have a student loan debt that's more than they'll be able to make for years in various jobs. But let's look at it in terms of what it means for the government. First, the very large debt load is certain sometime in the future, if not immediately, certainly in the future, to scare away foreign investors. and various individuals who in the past have been called upon to finance our debt. If you think about this, one way that some people put this is if the United States were to right now ask to be admitted into the European Union, there is a question as to whether or not the various countries in the European Union would actually be willing to admit the United States into the European Union, given its economic structure and its debt load. And so you have to understand that a lot of the debt that we have is debt that is owned by other individuals. One of the arguments that used to be made all the time, and since I've been doing this broadcast for more than 3 decades, I can remember back in the 1980s, we used to have people say, well, I'm not concerned about $1 trillion or $2 trillion in debt. Boy, does that seem like so little now, because we owe it to ourselves. But the reality is that really since the 1980s, a good significant amount, a very large significant amount of our debt is owned by people in other countries. Guess who? The Chinese. You know, when we talk about these trade wars and we talk about some of the conflict between the United States and China, they do control us in part because, after all, those are the individuals who don't necessarily like us, who own and have a fairly significant amount of debt. One former member of Congress put it this way: whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune, and foreign leaders aren't inclined to whistle Yankee Doodle. So that's the first concern. The second problem is these countries, even if they are our friends, and many of them are, they don't have an infinite source of credit. They have their own economies to deal with. Right now, the economic situation in the European Union isn't so good. And so they may want to put their investments closer to home, especially if they see Congress heading out on another huge spending spree. And some of the candidates right now have certainly been talking about that. And so the question we're asking is, are we approaching a time when this excessive borrowing could make the United States a bad credit risk? And so that is certainly one concern. The United States, we estimate, probably has China owning about 1.5, or perhaps as much as 1.1. It's kind of hard to tell how much trillion of our debt. Saudi Arabia had another $700 billion in assets. And these are concerns because you might remember when President Barack Obama was in office, one of the things the Saudis threatened at one time was to sell off some of their treasuries. And you could see that we get ourselves in a very difficult and tenuous situation when indeed some of these foreign countries own our debt. So these countries up until now have been lending America money that they may not want to invest in America in the future. They may decide for very good reasons, including their own economic health, to withdraw some of their investments. And as they begin to do that, they would then, of course, put us in a difficult situation. So the first issue is, of course, foreign influence. When we come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of others real quickly, and that is the economic debt bomb, because if indeed interest rates go up, a lot of what we spend in terms of the federal government is interest on the debt. Well, and the interest is only a penny or a cent or 2 or 3%, not a big deal. But if it goes up more, that becomes what's called the economic debt bomb. And then I also want to address one other issue, because I've always heard people say, well, we owe it to ourselves. Or some people say, well, yeah, but it's good debt, not bad debt. I mean, after all, if you have debt on your house and your house is appreciating, that's probably a good debt. Very different than a credit card debt because you don't have anything to show for it. So are the debts that we owe as a government good debt or bad debt? And then we'll get into some of the issues of personal debt as well. So a lot of things to cover here, and I feel the need to cover it simply because so few others are talking about it. So we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Senator Joe Manchin sees the irony. He says we have 11 million jobs that aren't filled, 8 million still unemployed. Something's not matching up here. Good, high-paying jobs go unfilled. The National Federation of Independent Business did a survey of small business owners and found that half of them reported job openings that could not be filled. That was a 48-year record high. We all know what happens if you pay people not to work, but the problem is more complex than that. The $300 weekly federal unemployment insurance bonus expired last month. Some economists estimate there might be another million job gains, but in August there were 5.3 million fewer jobs than when the pandemic began. Concerns about the virus may be one reason some aren't looking for work, but it may also be that more Americans got used to not working during the lockdown. In my most recent booklet, A Biblical View on Work, I suggest that the decline of a Christian worldview has also led to a decline of the work ethic. While it is tempting to say that Americans who aren't working are merely lazy, they're also rational. An economist at the University of Chicago found that when counting all government benefits, a family of four in high welfare benefit states such as New York and Connecticut with two unemployed parents can receive up to $100,000 in government assistance. That may be an extreme example, but it illustrates why we find unfilled jobs in trucking, manufacturing, and business services. These are high-paying jobs, but they must compete with generous government benefits along with COVID-19 concerns. This year, Americans should be working hard, but millions apparently are hardly working. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My topic this hour is debt, and we've been talking about government debt. I want to say a little bit more about that, then move on to personal and consumer debt. But let me just mention real quickly, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, I think some of you might say, I'd like some of the facts and figures that you're going to be mentioning today. And this is an Outlook article, series of articles that I'm going to be quoting from. And our Outlook magazine in May actually addressed this issue. So the first section that I'm talking about here is the section on government debt. And then I'll be looking in just a few minutes on personal debt. And then we'll be drawing some material from one of my books, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times. And of course, we have a booklet on debt as well. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like a little more information, I'd like to share this with my member of Congress, I'd like to share this with my family, I'd like to think about how to get myself out of debt, or I'd like to maybe reorganize my priorities, this Outlook magazine is something we're making available to you free. Simply go to pointofview.net, and there's a section where it says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get my free copy. And we are glad to make that available to you. It's at pointofview.net, and I would hope that you would take the time to do so. If you're not already a donor to Point of View, I might just mention that this is one of the benefits that come from supporting us. And in the future, we're going to have our Truth Team Week, where we're going to focus on some of the financial needs that we have. And if you join with us on the Truth Team for as little as, say, $1 a day, $30 a month, you will receive that automatically in the mail. For those of you that have received it in the past but say, I can't find my copy, I don't know where I put it, we're glad to send you another copy, and it's available at pointofview.net. Let me, if I can, finish this conversation about government debt, because the rest of our time We're going to talk about your own personal debt. But again, as I mentioned, when we talk about government debt, the first concern, of course, is foreign investment in America and the impact that that might have. But a second one that I wanted to address is what I call the economic debt bomb, because what we are talking about is a situation in which, because we owe so much, we have to pay interest on the debt. Now, the interest rates have been relatively low, but they're much higher than they were before, and as a result, probably will go higher. Let's use the 8 years of President Obama's administration to illustrate the point. When President Obama took office in 2009, the national debt at that time was $12 trillion, and the amount held by the public was $7 trillion, and I'm rounding down on both of those. When he left office, the national debt was $20 trillion, with $14 trillion held in the public. The way in which that didn't completely devastate the Obama administration and the economy was due to the fact that even though the debt was going up significantly, but at the same time, the interest rates were very low. But that is, I think, something that is part of the past. When the interest rates were low and kept from skyrocketing during the skyrocketing debt, it didn't put too much of a financial burden on the federal budget. Let's look ahead to 2020. By that time, the national debt will probably be $23 trillion, with approximately $18 trillion held by the public. And that's a reasonable estimate from the Congressional Budget Office. And when the interest rate was 1%, well, the cost of servicing that debt was significant, but not overwhelming. But now that the interest rate is, 3 times higher, and probably will go higher, you can see the possible concerns that this might have. Matter of fact, one Congressional Budget Office scenario for next year, the year of 2020, predicted that over half of all the personal income taxes would be required just to service the national debt. In fact, the annual debt service in that year, if that trend continues, will exceed our Social Security obligations. So you can see we've got some real problems. These are questions, by the way, to ask before we go any further, of individuals that keep telling us that we need to spend more. Whether it's Democrats who really want to go on a spending spree, at least those running for the presidency keep coming up with all sorts of ways in which we can spend even more money than we're spending right now. But even many Republicans as well, they say, well, we'll just spend this, or we'll put this project on hold, but we'll spend money on another project. You've just got to begin to ask yourself the question, what kind of resources do we have left in order to fund some of those? And economist Paul Samuelson reminds us that really the problem facing America can also be found in the world economy, which he estimates to have a debt load of about $247 trillion. So it isn't like there's another country that could even bail us out, assuming a country would want to do that, because they have problems of their own because they're spending more than they're taking in. Which brings me to one last point before we take a break, and that is good debt or bad debt. You know, one of the things we've heard over the years is that a debt is not bad if my guys are in the administration. And so I'll point out that, for example, when George W. Bush was president, there were people that voiced concern in his cabinet meetings about, well, what about tax cuts? Would this lead to larger federal deficits? And allegedly, Vice President Dick Cheney replied by saying, well, deficits don't matter. Well, interesting enough, then when President Barack Obama was in office, you have economist Paul Krugman writing for the New York Times. The man, by the way, is an economist who actually wrote that debt is good. And because he has a Nobel Prize to his credit, it was easy to believe that he settled the discussion. But it's interesting how his tune changed the moment President Trump took office. And that's kind of been the scenario more recently. And here's something I've mentioned before on the air, but it's worth mentioning again. Most political commentators won't tell you this. When economists like the president in office, the national debt isn't a big deal. When they dislike the president in office, the national debt is a catastrophe. Sadly, of course, the national debt goes up year after year, whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether we have Congress controlled by Republicans or Democrats. Now, to be fair, Democrats tend to spend more and faster than Republicans, but you really have to go back a long, long way in American economic history to find a time in which we balanced the budget. The closest we've come in recent times happened in the 1990s when they claimed that they balanced the budget, and this happened under the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and President Bill Clinton. But even those weren't really balanced because they were borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. But that's the closest we've come to anything that looked even like a balanced budget. And that, of course, was in the 1990s. You have to go back even further than that before you find a government that actually balances its budget. So interestingly enough, the argument being made by Paul Krugman, I'll get back to that, was that issuing debt is a way to pay for useful things. And we should do more of that when the price is right. He says the United States suffers obvious deficiencies in roads, rails, water systems, and more meaningfully, the federal government can borrow at historic low rates. And so his argument was, just a few years ago, actually debt might be a good thing because we can rebuild the roads and rails and water systems, and the interest rates are low. And while that might have been true when we had low interest rates, first of all, that's no longer the case. But here's the bigger problem. Most of the money being spent by the federal government is not being used to build infrastructure. You know, those so-called shovel-ready projects turned out not to be quite so shovel-ready after all. In most cases, we were borrowing money to fund social services. So again, good debt, bad debt. As we get into the whole issue of your own personal debt, borrowing money to fix up your house, probably really a good investment, especially if someday you decide to sell your house for more money. Borrowing to fix up your house is very different than borrowing money to use on your credit card to buy an expensive meal that is here today and gone tomorrow. So again, you can see that we are, as a country, been running into debt and borrowing more and more money. That is not a good prescription for the future. So when we come back from the break, I want to move from government debt to personal debt. And that is to recognize that just as we recognize America as a country is in debt, so Americans are in debt as well. And what does the Bible have to say about this? What are the different types of debt that we find individuals into? And certainly, I hope that this would encourage you to get out of debt, because certainly the scriptures are very clear that indeed when you are in debt, in Proverbs 22:7, it says, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. Probably better translated, a borrower is a slave to the lender. Get yourself out of slavery, get yourself out of debt. We'll talk more about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the subject of debt. And let me just mention that one of the resources I wanted to provide to you free of charge, it is the Outlook magazine, and some of you may have already received it if you're a donor to Point of View. Came out in May, but you may have misplaced it or you'd like to find it again. This is a PDF which we can send out, and all you have to do is go to pointofview.net, click on that button there that says Point of View Outlook magazine, the national and personal debt crisis in America. If by chance some of you say, well, I don't have a computer or I don't know how to read it on a PDF and I'd like to get a printed copy, I'm sure you can just give us a call or leave a note. And of course, you're very familiar with the fact that we do provide resources to you so that you can contact us. And if you'd like to get a copy, like to make that available to you, because this is an issue that deserves more attention. And that's why I'm giving you an opportunity to not only read these magazine articles, but also to apply them to your life. We spent some time talking about the government. Let's talk about personal debt, because as I said just a minute ago, not only is America as a country in debt, but Americans themselves are in debt. And that's because of choices they've made about consumer goods, lifestyle choices, educational opportunities. Debt isn't necessarily wrong, but the level of personal debt indebtedness today should be of concern to so many. I cannot overemphasize the significant impact of debt on our society. It has been, as we've documented before with some of our economic advisors that have been on this program, the leading cause for divorce. It's a reason for many troubled marriages. It's one of the causes for depression as well as suicide. And the level of personal indebtedness in this country is a relatively recent phenomenon. Matter of fact, I spend some time in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, talking about some of the history, because less than a century ago, you didn't even really have anything that were like credit cards. Yes, you could go into the general store and say, put it on my tab, and people would eventually pay that, but that was pretty unusual. We did not have credit cards. Mortgages were pretty much unusual there as well. Some of those began to proliferate more when GIs returned from the war, but you have to recognize that it was a relatively recent 20th century and now 21st century phenomenon about that. And so as a result, we are dealing with a level of indebtedness in America and in many other countries around the world that is unprecedented. There are some countries where debt is not as encouraged as it is here, and where savings is encouraged. And I've used some of those examples on the air, but that certainly doesn't seem to be what we find here in the country of the United States or in many of the European countries right now. So what does the Bible have to say about debt before we get into the different forms of debt? Just a minute ago, I read from Proverbs 22, verse 7, the rich rule over the poor, but the borrower is a servant to the lender. And if you think about this, the Bible says quite a bit about money. Many of the parables that Jesus uses are about money. And certainly there is the idea that when you borrow money and you are then in debt, you're putting yourself in a situation where the lender has a greater influence over you. If you're looking for some other verses, there are certainly some that we can talk about in the Proverbs, which are certainly replete with lots of examples. In this particular article that I've written about your personal debt, I talk about Proverbs 17, Proverbs 22, Proverbs 27, and others. And so we can certainly see that we are warned about going into debt. Now, the other day I did mention on the air that some people have maybe misinterpreted at least one passage in the New Testament, and that is in Romans 13, verse 8. It says, Paul says to the church there in Rome, owe nothing to anyone. And so that has been a teaching that some churches have used to say, well, that means that Christians could never go into debt. And although some have tried to argue that this verse prohibits debt, you really need to see it in the context, because the passage is really not so much a specific teaching about debt, but rather kind of this idea that we have a duty as Christians to government authority. And more importantly, I've said as well that if the Bible really were to prohibit debt, then why does the Bible say so much about debt? I mean, as a matter of fact, it talks about various principles that you would use in terms of debt. So I think you can recognize that it's probably a misunderstanding of that verse to do so. And there is also, I think, a very important distinction we should make between debt and credit. We made a distinction a minute ago between so-called good debt and bad debt, but credit is very different. Often in our society, the two words are used interchangeably, but debt is something that is owed, and the Bible does not prohibit borrowing. It certainly does not recommend it, but credit is the establishment of a mutual trust between a lender and a borrower. We could argue that some people even actually end up in debt to do no fault of their own. They've been swindled in a business. They have made a good faith attempt to start a business, but were unsuccessful. They might have been cheated out by a supplier. They may have been unfairly sued in court. They may have had to go into debt to care for a loved one. So I recognize that debt doesn't necessarily mean a moral failing, but it does mean that it does put you in a very difficult set of circumstances. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to address it as well. What are some of the kinds of debt? Well, the first would be credit card debt. You know, I've said before that as Americans sometimes criticize the federal government for going into debt, they might want to look at their own credit card statements, because now the estimates are that the credit card debt for Americans in general is about $1 trillion. Matt Schultz, who is the senior industry analyst for creditcards.com, says that the record should serve as a wake-up call to Americans to focus on their credit card debt. He even adds that even if you feel your debt is manageable right now, know that you could be one unexpected emergency away from real trouble. And that kind of reminds me of something I wrote about years ago in terms of a study that was done by the Federal Reserve Board. They actually surveyed Americans, and they asked respondents how would they pay for a $400 emergency. And they found that 47% of respondents said they would cover that expense by either borrowing or selling something. In other words, the argument was they couldn't come up with $400 any other way. Now, in a very insightful article that appeared in The Atlantic by Neil Gabler, he said, "Who knew?" You know, and then he answers, "I knew because I was one of them. I found that every time I would have new bills, I didn't have a check to pay for them." And so he said you could look at his resume as a writer and even conclude he was doing fine. He was in the middle class, even the upper middle class, with 5 books and hundreds of articles. But he called this the shame of the middle class. And one of the financial analysts even said you're more likely to hear from your buddy that he's using Viagra than the fact that he has credit card problems. And so back to our article that appeared in Outlook, when you start looking at this situation, you recognize that many Americans are borrowing, but they're not paying it off. It's one thing to have a credit card and pay it off every month, but more than half, 55%, don't regularly pay off their credit card in full. Even greater concern is that about 37 million credit card accounts had a 90-plus day delinquency mark as a result to their credit report last quarter. And the credit card debt seems to be increasing while the incomes of Americans are increasing. So that brings us back to whether or not we're living within our means. Something else that was kind of interesting, credit card debt increases by age. The average credit card debt for Americans under 35 years of age is about $5,000 plus, but 45 to 54 is about $9,000 plus. So you can see over time that increases rather dramatically. And the average American consumer owns usually at least 3 credit cards, and the average interest that they pay is more than 16%. So that is certainly one of those kinds of debts you want to pay off. But when we come back from the break, I'll talk about a few other of those debts and then conclude with some of the consequences of debt that the scriptures talk about as well. So again, if you would like to find out a little bit more about this issue of debt, maybe this would be something helpful in terms of your own planning, or if you'd like to just maybe use some of these facts and figures to share with your family members or your member of Congress, again, go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll see a banner there that says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get your free copy, and all you need to do is give us your name and address and email so we can send the PDF to you. If some of you would like a printed copy, of course, you can contact Point of View there as well, and we would be glad to send one of those out, and certainly encourage you to learn a little bit more about debt and the impact that it is having on your life and on the government. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Got a few more minutes talking about the subject of debt, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to look at some of the material that you've been reading from and summarizing, you are welcome to go to our website, pointofview.net, and find this particular Outlook magazine in which we focus on the subject of both government debt and personal debt. And in these last few minutes, let me talk about some of the other kinds of debt. Auto loan debt is another one of those issues where you have, again, the collective debt in terms of auto is at about, again, $1 trillion. About half of Americans rely on an auto loan to finance a vehicle. And so that illustrates, again, something that is changing. Back in 2003, about 74 million Americans had auto loans. Now it's 108 million. So that has gone up dramatically. And sadly, millions of auto loans are in delinquency, a fact that sometimes we are, as Americans, taking out loans with repayment periods longer than the time they plan to own the vehicle. And so that obviously illustrates, again, a very bad investment. At least you have something concrete, but it is a depreciating asset, so that's something to think about. And the one that's been in the news quite a bit lately is student loan debt. And the reasons it's in the news is because the amount owed is about $1.5 trillion by more than 44 million borrowers. If you've listened to this program, we've pointed out that when you look at, say, the baby boom generation, or even the so-called baby buster generation, those individuals did take out loans, but it was about a fourth of them did. By the time you get to the millennial generation, it is more than half. And so you can see that, first of all, that is due to the unbelievably skyrocketing cost of higher education. And as a result, the average college student will graduate with $37,000 in student loan, and that's the average. I've certainly seen some that almost go into the six figures. So, and the student loan delinquency rate, I might just mention, that's the so-called default rate, is very significant as well, at least at 10%. And so this is why it's become quite a political issue here in America. Well, we can talk about debt all day, but what about the consequences of debt? And how do we get out of debt? Some of the consequences, first of all, of course, I talked about in Proverbs 22, the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender. It really is a reminder that debt can be slavery. You've always heard the old phrase, I owe, so it's off to work I go. And really, if you're deeply in debt, I mean, it constrains your choices about buying a new car, about moving, about going on a vacation. So that is one of those situations. I do point out in the article that a lot of people that are in debt sort of deny reality. They hope that they're going to win the lottery. They hope that if they just ignore the debt, it will just go away. But probably the greatest concern is just the incredible amount of stress that debt puts into our lives. And so there, I think, is just an incredible need for us to come up with some different ways to begin to get out of debt. And in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, I have a whole section on how to get out of debt, but let me mention just 5 very quick points before we end the program today. And the first is to establish right priorities. How many times when we had a certified financial planner in this studio or somebody by phone, they want to remind us that, first of all, God owns it all. You see this in Psalm 24, in Job 41. And so as a result, sometimes we think that we own it all, but really we are just stewards of the resources God has placed in our hand. And so I think it's really important to recognize that in terms of our debt, in terms of our lifestyle, in terms of our giving, we need to honor the Lord in all that we do. Number 2, stop borrowing. It's really interesting because you have some unbelievable statistics that show that even after sometimes people file bankruptcy, and they, you would think, had learned their lesson from all of the problems they had economically, they maybe last 6 months before they start borrowing again. And I've used the illustration that if a pipe breaks in your house, the first thing you do is shut off the water before you stop mopping it up. Or another illustration is if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And so that is certainly the case. Don't use your credit card. Don't take out a bank loan. Start thinking about what is the next step. Number 3, of course, is to develop a budget. And there are all sorts of great ministries out there that we've made available to you in the past that help you begin to come together with a budget. You begin by making a list of your monthly expenses. That's your mortgage or your rent, your utilities, it's your groceries, it's your car payments, your credit card bills, all those kinds of things. And then really try to establish some kind of priority for the loans that you want to start to pay off and try to pay them off in a systematic way. I've suggested sometimes that the priority should be, if you have one set of debt and credit cards or loans that have the highest interest rate, pay those off first. If for no other reason, then that is the one that is probably burdening you the most. If they're all about the same, then maybe there's a value in paying off the smallest one, because then you would have to be able to cross that off the list, and you'd have a sense of success, a sense of momentum going in the right direction. And also, if you find yourself, after you've created a budget, write to your creditor with a repayment plan so that that individual understands that you at least have a realistic budget and you're really trying to address the issue. Number 4, that is, begin to retire your debt. And this is one I was mentioning just a minute ago. If they all are of different rates, then I would want to pay off the highest interest rate first. If they're all comparable, you might want to pay off the smallest one just so you have some level of success. And finally, number 5, develop new spending habits. Because if it was spending that got you into that debt, and sometimes it isn't, sometimes it has to do with health reversals, sometimes it has to do with all sorts of problems that you face because somebody swindled you out of a particular set of circumstances or finances, or you were sued in court or whatever. But if it was spending that got you into the problem, then changing your spending habits will get you out of the problem. And, of course, there's a lot more we can say. Even in an entire hour, we haven't covered all the aspects of debt. But I did want to address it, as I said before, for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because we have this Outlook magazine that we wanted to make available to you, and that is something that you can have access to. Of course, we have this little booklet on debt that we've been making available to our donors. And I think, if nothing else, this is a good illustration of why your support to Point of View will provide you with some of the resources to address some of the very difficult economic circumstances you find yourself in. But more importantly, in the first half of this hour, you heard us talk about government debt. And I think it's about time to start asking some of these individuals that are going to be knocking on your door, sending you letters, making phone calls, wanting you to vote for them. We need to know what they plan to do to get the United States out of debt, because each year the deficit is there. And that means that the national debt grows every single year. And at some point, we are going to find that there are some economic consequences, some very dire economic consequences to not addressing this issue of debt. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to cover some of this. And again, let me encourage you to look at our website today. And you can, first of all, find the Outlook magazine. And that is something we want to make available to you. If you go to the very bottom of the page, there's a search engine there. You can type in the word debt and finance, and you will find many of the other articles we've posted in the past, which I hope will be of use to you as you begin to look at the problems of government debt and your own personal problems of personal debt. So that's all we have for today to address this issue of debt. And I appreciate you listening to Point of View. And if you would like to find more, it's all at our website, pointofview.net.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.